Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. The moment I walked into the Airbnb, I felt a strange sensation crawl over me. It was a beautiful place, clean, modern, and just the right size for a solo trip I had been planning for months. The host had left a note welcoming me, and a small basket of snacks was placed on the table. Everything seemed perfect on the surface, but something about the bathroom felt a little too sterile. The light was harsh, the air vent hummed louder than I expected, and there was this faint scent of cleaning chemicals that lingered longer than it should. After a long drive, I took a hot shower to unwind. I stood under the stream of water, trying to let the tension in my shoulders melt away. While drying off, I noticed something odd about the vent above the mirror. It was positioned at an angle that pointed directly toward the shower. Most bathroom vents I had seen before were either centered on the ceiling or over the toilet. This one seemed almost deliberate in its placement. I ignored the thought at first, brushing it off as me being overly suspicious. The idea of someone spying on me was absurd, or so I told myself. I went to bed that night after double-checking that the doors and windows were locked. The place was quiet except for the occasional passing car outside. I tried to relax, thinking I was just overthinking things due to the new environment. The next morning, I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stared at the vent again while brushing my teeth. The screws looked newer than the rest of the hardware in the room, and the edges of the vent frame seemed slightly misaligned. I stood on the toilet to get a closer look, reaching up to touch it. That was when I noticed the smallest glint of light reflecting back at me. My heart started pounding as I leaned in closer. There, tucked behind the slats of the vent, was a tiny lens. It was barely noticeable, unless you looked at it from the right angle. I stepped down immediately, trying to control the rising panic in my chest. I grabbed my phone and took a few pictures, making sure I had proof of what I was seeing. I felt nauseated, violated, unsure of what to do next. I paced the room, replaying every moment I had spent in the bathroom. I thought of how I had walked around naked, how I had used the toilet, how vulnerable I had been without knowing someone might have been watching. I felt like my privacy had been ripped away from me. I could not stay there another night. I packed my things in a rush, hands shaking as I zipped up my suitcase. My only goal was to get out of there as quickly as possible. I contacted the booking platform immediately and filed a report, attaching the pictures I had taken. I explained everything in detail, from the strange placement of the vent to the camera lens I discovered behind it. The representative I spoke to was professional but cold, stating they would escalate the case to the appropriate department. I also called the local police station, reporting what I found and giving them the address of the property. They told me to wait while they dispatched an officer to meet me at a nearby location. Sitting in my car in a gas station parking lot, I could not stop looking at the photo of the hidden camera. It made me feel sick knowing that there were people in the world who could do this without remorse. The officer arrived within 30 minutes, a kind and patient man who listened carefully. He took my statement, asked to see the photos, and called for backup to inspect the property. He told me I had done the right thing by leaving and not tampering with the camera itself. While the police investigated, I stayed in a hotel not too far away. I kept the curtains closed and barely slept that night, overwhelmed with thoughts of what could have happened. The following day, I received a call from the officer, letting me know that they had confirmed the presence of the hidden camera. It was connected to a remote system, one that allowed someone to watch in real time from another device. They were working on tracking down the person responsible, and I was listed as a victim in their case. The platform removed the listing within a few hours after police confirmation. They issued a full refund and offered to cover the cost of my hotel stay. I appreciated the gesture, but it did little to restore the sense of safety I had lost. I spent hours on the phone with customer service, pressing them to hold the property owner accountable. I did not want anyone else to experience what I had gone through. I started researching hidden camera laws and how to protect myself during future travels. I ordered a small camera detector device online and vowed to always scan every place I stayed in, no matter how clean or luxurious it looked. I even shared my story anonymously online to warn others. The support I received was overwhelming, with many thanking me for speaking out. I felt a little stronger knowing that my experience could help others stay safe. A few weeks later, I received an update from the police. The investigation had led them to a man who had placed multiple hidden cameras in properties he listed under different names. He had been renting out the Airbnb using a fake identity, and mine was not the only case. Thanks to my report, they were able to arrest him and seize his equipment. The detective told me that my quick action had likely prevented more victims from being exploited. I was relieved to hear that justice was being served. The officer thanked me for my courage and encouraged me to continue being vigilant. Though the experience had shaken me deeply, I began to feel like I was reclaiming my power. I continued to travel, but with more awareness, more caution, and more confidence. The fear did not disappear completely, but it no longer controlled me. I learned to trust my instincts more. That uneasy feeling I had when I first walked into the bathroom was not just paranoia. It was my intuition trying to protect me. I realized that listening to that inner voice was not only important but necessary. I reminded myself that I deserved to feel safe, especially at a place meant for rest. The experience reminded me of the strength I carried even when I felt afraid. Eventually, I was able to let go of the anger and the shame. I stopped blaming myself for what had happened and started focusing on how I responded. I chose not to let fear stop me from living my life. I continued exploring new places, meeting new people, and embracing adventure, but always with an extra layer of care. The memory of what I discovered in that bathroom would always stay with me, but it would no longer define me. Now, whenever I walk into a new room, I scan the ceilings, vents, and electrical outlets without hesitation. It is no longer a burden, but a habit that gives me peace of mind. I encourage friends and family to do the same, offering advice without trying to scare them. I tell them that awareness is the first step to safety. I may have lost a sense of innocence that day, but I gained something even more valuable in return. I found courage I did not know I had. I turned a terrifying moment into an opportunity to protect others. I stood up, spoke out, and made a difference, even if it started with just one voice. The road to healing was not easy, but it led me to a stronger, wiser version of myself. And in the end, that gave me back the sense of peace I thought I had lost. Story 2. It was my second week working night shifts alone at a remote gas station just off the highway. The place was quiet, with barely any customers coming through after midnight. Most of my shift was spent restocking shelves, sweeping the floor, and checking the monitors behind the counter. I liked the solitude, especially since I had gotten used to being alone during those hours. The silence gave me time to think and breathe without distractions. One night around 2 a.m., I found a folded piece of paper on the counter when I returned from sweeping the restroom area. I had not heard anyone come in, and the door chime had not rung. The note was simple, written in blue ink with neat handwriting. It said, "You look tired tonight. Get some rest when you can." A chill went through me, and I scanned the cameras, but there was no sign of anyone near the building. I assumed maybe it was one of the truckers who had stopped by earlier, someone just being kind. But still, I checked the logs to see who had come in during the last hour. Only 2 customers had passed through, and both had spoken with me at the register. Neither had time to sneak a note onto the counter without being noticed. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had missed something while restocking. The following night, I made sure to stay near the counter as much as possible. I kept one eye on the monitors and the other on the front door. At exactly the same time, another note appeared, this time tucked under the edge of the cash register. It read, "I hope you are not scared. I just like watching you work." That message made my heart race, and I locked the door for the rest of the night. Even though the store was open 24 hours, I told myself it was better to be safe. I spent the rest of this shift looking out the windows and checking the cameras every few minutes. I saw nothing unusual, no figures lurking in the shadows, no unfamiliar cars. Still, the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after my shift ended. I told no one about the notes, unsure how to explain them without sounding paranoid. On my nights off, I tried to forget the unease and enjoy some rest, but I kept thinking about those notes. I replayed the moments in my head, wondering how someone could have placed them without being seen. The gas station only had one entrance for customers, and the cameras covered every corner. There was no blind spot, at least not one I had noticed before. When I returned for my next shift, I did a full walk around before starting. Everything was in place, and the building looked just as I had left it. I stood behind the counter, alert and ready for anything. That night, no note appeared. It was the first time in 3 shifts that I had not received one. I felt both relieved and uneasy. A few hours before sunrise, I stepped outside to take the trash out back. The air was cold, and the wind picked up slightly, rustling the plastic bags. As I turned to go back in, I noticed something taped to the back door. It was another note, and this one said, "You should not go outside alone. Not at night." I froze in place, heart pounding as I scanned the empty lot and the surrounding woods. I backed into the building and locked the door behind me. That was when I realized whoever was leaving the notes knew my routines. They had been watching long enough to know when I took the trash out, how often I left the counter, and what time I usually took breaks. It felt too personal now. I could not keep pretending this was harmless. I decided to tell the manager. I waited until the next morning and explained everything. He listened without interrupting, then checked the camera footage from the past few nights. We saw nothing. The videos showed me working, walking, cleaning, but no sign of anyone approaching the doors or slipping notes under the register. It was as if the person had vanished before the camera could catch them. The manager offered to let me switch to day shifts, but I declined. I wanted to figure out who was doing this and how. I became more vigilant. I checked the perimeter every hour. I set up my phone to record video of the counter in case the store's cameras missed something. I even placed small items in specific ways to see if they were disturbed. It did not take long for another note to appear. This time, it was on the inside of the cooler door. I opened it to restock drinks and found it taped to the glass. You do not need to be afraid. I would never hurt you. That message did not comfort me. If anything, it made things worse. It meant the person had gotten inside without my knowledge. I replayed the footage again and again. There was no sign of entry, no moment when I turned away long enough for someone to sneak in. My phone had recorded nothing useful either. Just static and faint clicking noises I could not explain. I felt helpless, trapped in a mystery that kept getting more disturbing with each passing night. Then one evening, something changed. A man came in just after midnight, wearing a hooded jacket and sunglasses, even though it was dark outside. He kept his head down and bought only a bottle of water. His voice was low, and he barely looked at me. But something about him felt off. He lingered near the back shelves for too long before finally leaving. After he was gone, I checked the aisle he had stood in. Tucked behind a can of soup was another note. You are smarter than the others. I like that. My stomach dropped. It confirmed what I had feared. This person had been coming inside, watching me from within the store, not just outside in the dark. I gave the note to the manager and told him about the man with the hood. We reviewed the footage together, but once again, the camera showed no one placing anything on the shelves. It was impossible. I had seen him, spoken to him, and yet there was no trace of the note being placed. The manager began to suspect I was playing some kind of joke, or worse, making it up. I knew I was not imagining it. I started writing down everything, documenting each detail from every shift. I noted the time, the weather, any cars that passed by, and anything strange that happened. I even sketched out the layout of the store and marked where each note had been found. It helped me feel more in control, even if the notes kept coming. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on the glass door. I looked up from the counter and saw no one. Just the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. But when I stepped closer, there was a note pressed to the outside of the glass. It said, "I want to see your smile again." You used to smile more. I backed away slowly and locked the door again. That was the turning point for me. I realized I had stopped smiling, stopped laughing, stopped feeling safe. This job was supposed to be simple, just a way to earn money and pass the time during quiet hours. But it had become something else, something that was starting to take a toll on my mind. The manager finally agreed to install new cameras and motion sensors around the building. For the next few nights, I saw nothing, heard nothing, and received no new notes. The silence was unsettling, but I welcomed it. It felt like I could finally breathe again without constantly looking over my shoulder. One morning near the end of my shift, a police cruiser pulled into the lot. The officer stepped out and came inside, asking if I was the one who had been receiving strange notes. I nodded, unsure how he knew. He told me they had arrested a man found hiding in a small drainage tunnel across the highway. He had been living there, watching the gas station from a distance. Inside his belongings were dozens of notes written in the same handwriting I had seen over the past few weeks. Some had never been delivered. Some were much more disturbing than the ones I had received. The officer told me I was lucky, that it could have ended badly if the man had decided to come closer. I stayed on the night shift for a few more months, but things were never the same. I kept watching the cameras, checking behind shelves and listening for sounds that were not there. Eventually, I moved on to a different job in a safer part of town. The experience stayed with me, but I refused to let it define me. I had survived it, and that was enough. Story 3. I had been needing extra space for months. My apartment was getting crowded with things I did not want to throw away but also did not use often. So I finally decided to rent a storage unit at a facility not too far from where I lived. It was a quiet place, mostly concrete and metal buildings, with rows of identical roll-up doors. The manager gave me a tour and assigned me a unit that seemed clean and secure. After moving in a few boxes, I noticed something odd in the far corner of the unit. There was a large freezer sitting against the wall, locked and covered in a thin layer of dust. I knew immediately that it was not mine. The previous renter must have left it behind, and somehow the staff had missed it during their inspection. I considered reporting it right away, but curiosity got the better of me. The lock looked old and slightly rusted. I tried tugging at it, but it would not budge. I thought about asking the staff to remove it, but something about the freezer intrigued me. I kept imagining what could be inside. Maybe it was something valuable, or maybe just old food someone forgot. For a few days, I let it be. Every time I visited to drop off or pick up something, I looked at it. Its presence started bothering me more than I expected. One night I brought a bolt cutter with me, telling myself it was just to check if there was anything dangerous inside. I waited until it was late and the facility was nearly empty. The lock snapped with a loud click, and I hesitated before lifting the lid. A strange smell hit me immediately, not strong enough to choke, but definitely unpleasant. Inside, everything was wrapped tightly in thick black plastic bags. There were no labels, no markings, just layers of dark, heavy material. I stared at it for a long time, unsure if I should touch anything. My hands trembled slightly as I reached in. The first bag was tied with a knot that took some effort to undo. Inside, I found pieces of what looked like clothing. They were stained and stiff, as if they had been wet and then frozen. There was no sign of mold, but the fabric had a strange texture. I dropped it back into the freezer and stepped away. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat on my back. I was not sure what I had expected, but it certainly was not that. I closed the lid and left the unit quickly, locking the door behind me. That night I could barely sleep, my thoughts spinning around what I had seen. I told myself it was probably just old junk, nothing serious. The next day, I came back determined to finish what I started. I brought gloves this time, and a flashlight. The air in the unit felt colder than usual, even though it was warm outside. I opened the freezer again and started going through the rest of the bags. Most were filled with similar items, old clothes, shoes, and personal belongings. But then I found something different. One of the bags was heavier than the others and tied with multiple knots. I struggled to open it, and when I finally did, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were stacks of notebooks and photos. The pages were damp and stuck together in places, but still legible. I sat on the floor and began to read. The notebooks were journals, filled with entries written in neat handwriting. They spoke of fear, of hiding, of feeling watched. Some entries mentioned names I did not recognize, and others described places and events that seemed familiar. There were drawings too, crude sketches of faces and rooms. The deeper I read, the more unsettled I became. The photos were faded, some of them clearly taken without the subjects knowing. A few showed people sitting in cars, walking into buildings, standing at windows. Others were more disturbing, close-ups of hands, feet, and other parts of the body. I could not understand the purpose behind them, and I began to question my decision to open the freezer. I packed everything back up and stood there for a long time. Part of me wanted to leave it all behind and never come back, but another part felt responsible. If something terrible had happened, I could not ignore it. I knew I had to do the right thing, no matter how uncomfortable it made me feel. I drove to the nearest police station and asked to speak with someone. I explained everything, from renting the unit to finding the locked freezer and what was inside. They took me seriously, which was both a relief and a concern. Officers followed me back to the facility and examined the contents themselves. They sealed off the unit and began an investigation. For weeks I heard nothing, though I received updates that they were looking into the previous renter. Eventually I was called back to give a formal statement. The officers thanked me for coming forward and told me that I may have helped uncover something that had been hidden for years. I was moved to a different unit, one that was empty and freshly cleaned. The facility offered me a few months of free rent for the inconvenience. I appreciated the gesture, but I still felt uneasy every time I visited. I could not look at the place the same way again, knowing what had once been hidden behind that locked door. In time, I stopped thinking about it so much. The nightmares faded, and the unease turned into a distant memory. But I focused on my routine again, using the unit only for what I had originally intended. Life went back to normal, slowly but surely. And yet, a small part of me never forgot that freezer and what it contained. I learned something important through the experience. Sometimes doing the right thing means stepping into something dark and uncomfortable. But truth matters, and people deserve to be found, even if their stories are buried deep and frozen in time. I never found out exactly what happened or who those journals belonged to, but I know I did not turn away. That storage unit became more than a place to keep my extra stuff. It reminded me that even in the quiet corners of everyday life, there can be secrets waiting to be uncovered. I no longer felt curious about mysteries like that. Curiosity had its limits, and I had found mine. Still, I walked away knowing I had made a difference, even if no one ever said it out loud. Story 4. The job listing seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate for extra income. It promised flexible hours, decent pay, and no experience required. The description mentioned clerical work and basic errands for a small home-based business. I figured I could squeeze it into my current schedule without too much trouble. I responded to the posting and received a reply within the hour. The message I got sounded professional enough. They said they had reviewed my background and thought I was a great fit. We exchanged a few more messages, and then they asked if I could meet in person for a short orientation. The location was not far from where I lived, so I agreed to meet the next afternoon. They even sent a pin of the address and said they would meet me outside. I told someone I trusted where I was going, just in case. I shared the address and time, brushing it off as a safety habit. That afternoon I got ready and left home early to make sure I arrived on time. I wore something simple and brought only what I needed in a small bag. The streets were quiet as I followed the map on my phone. The address led me to a neighborhood I had never visited before. It was not far from the main road, but it felt oddly empty. Houses were spaced far apart, and there were no people outside. I walked up to what looked like an abandoned property, confused but thinking maybe I got the location wrong. I messaged the person, and they responded right away, telling me to walk through the side gate. A part of me hesitated, but I had come this far and wanted to give it a chance. I opened the gate and walked into the backyard, where an unfamiliar man was waiting. He smiled and introduced himself, saying he was part of the company. Something about his tone felt rehearsed, too smooth. He waved me over and gestured toward a small detached building at the back of the property. I followed, but my instincts were starting to scream. I glanced around and noticed there were no other cars, no equipment, nothing to show any kind of business was happening here. He opened the door and told me to step inside, saying it was the office. The room was dimly lit, and once I stepped in, I realized I had made a mistake. Before I could react, another man appeared behind me and closed the door. Panic surged through me as I turned around. The door was locked, and both men stood in front of it, blocking my way. I tried to stay calm, pretending not to panic, but my heart was racing. One of them told me to sit down and not to scream. I sat, trying to stay alert and think of what to do. They started asking strange questions that had nothing to do with any job, where I lived, who I lived with, if anyone was expecting me back soon. I knew I had to lie and make them believe someone would notice if I did not return soon. I told them someone knew exactly where I was and was waiting for a check-in message. One of the men looked at his phone and frowned. He stepped out, and I could hear him making a call. The other man stayed near the door, arms crossed, watching me. I looked around the room for anything I could use to defend myself or break a window. There were no sharp objects, and the windows were barred. The only light came from a small lamp in the corner. I pretended to be calm, asking about the job again and acting confused. I wanted them to underestimate me. The man returned, speaking quietly to the other one. They both looked uneasy, like something had changed. The first man turned to me and asked if I really told someone I was coming here. I repeated that someone knew exactly where I was and had the address. I told them I was supposed to send a message as soon as the meeting ended, or they would call 911. I could see them glance at each other, whispering in low tones. I stayed quiet and waited, watching their every move. They walked out again and left the door slightly ajar. I stood slowly and crept to the door. I could hear them arguing outside. Without thinking twice, I slipped through the door and ran. I did not look back, just ran through the yard, out the gate, and down the road toward the main street. My breath was short, and my legs ached, but I did not stop. I made it to a nearby store and rushed inside. The clerk looked alarmed as I explained what happened. They let me use their phone to call someone. I called the person I had told earlier and told them to alert the police. Within minutes, help was on the way. The police arrived quickly, and I gave them every detail I could remember. They took the address and went to investigate. Later, I found out the building had been used before for similar setups, but no one had come forward until now. I was lucky I had told someone and trusted my instincts. If I had ignored that voice in my head, I might not have made it out. I spent the rest of that day shaken but safe. I kept thinking about how careful we have to be even when we are just looking for honest work. It is frightening how people can take advantage of desperation. I promised myself I would be more cautious and never meet anyone alone at unfamiliar places again. I learned a hard lesson that day, but I was grateful I survived. In the days that followed, I reported everything I could to the authorities. They encouraged me to share my story to help prevent this from happening to others. I did not want anyone else falling into a trap like I almost did. It was not easy to talk about, but I knew it might save someone else. The more awareness people had, the safer everyone would be. Eventually, I returned to my normal routine. I was more cautious with every job application and took extra steps to verify every detail. I stopped responding to vague offers and insisted on video calls or professional emails before meeting anyone. I also made sure to always let someone know where I was going and when I would be back. My trust was shaken, but I was determined not to live in fear. Despite everything, I managed to move forward. I found safer opportunities and built connections with people who were genuine. It took time, but I slowly felt like myself again. Each day was a reminder of what I had been through and how easily it could have ended differently. But I was alive, and that was all that mattered. What happened changed me, but it did not break me. I became more aware, more careful, and more grateful. I never forgot that day, but I refused to let it define my future. I used the experience to grow stronger and smarter. In the end, I took my life back and refused to let fear win. Story 5. It started out subtly, so subtly that I convinced myself I was being paranoid. But I would notice small things out of place. My coffee cup was on the opposite side of the table from where I left it. A hoodie I wore yesterday smelled faintly of cologne I did not use. I tried to shake off the unease. I thought maybe I was just tired or distracted from working too many late nights. Then I began noticing someone watching me. It was not every day, but often enough that I started keeping mental notes. A figure across the street when I walked to the bus stop. A parked car that seemed to show up near my apartment every few days. Each time I looked directly at it, it would drive off or the person would turn away. I told myself it could be coincidence. But the feeling grew. The sense of being observed became impossible to ignore. I would walk into a room and feel eyes on me. My phone would buzz with calls from unknown numbers that hung up after one ring. At first I just blocked them, thinking it was some scam. Then they started calling at times when I was doing very specific things. One evening, I got a message that said I looked tired after my workout. I had not posted anything about going to the gym. I had not spoken to anyone there. I always went alone, and I wore the same nondescript clothes. That was when it hit me fully. Someone was watching me, and they had been doing it for a while. I started double-checking all the locks. I bought new curtains and made sure they were shut tight before I changed clothes. I even covered my laptop camera with a sticker. But nothing helped the pit in my stomach. No matter how careful I was, it felt like this person knew everything. They knew what time I left for work, what time I returned, what groceries I bought. Once I got a note inside my apartment. It was a small piece of paper sitting on my kitchen counter. It said I should try a different brand of cereal because mine was boring. I froze. I lived alone and I always locked the door. No sign of forced entry. I reported it to the police, but they could not do anything. There was no proof of who it was, no fingerprints, no cameras nearby that caught anything. They told me to be careful and call if anything escalated. That did not help me sleep better at night. I started carrying pepper spray everywhere. I also began changing my routine. I would leave for work earlier or later than usual. I took different routes to avoid being predictable. I even switched gyms and stopped going to the same coffee shop. But somehow, this person still kept up. They would comment about how the new gym was better lit, or how the pastries at the new cafe were overpriced. The fear took over my life. I stopped seeing friends. I avoided going out unless I had to. At night, I kept the lights on and the television playing just to feel less alone. I began sleeping on the couch because my bedroom felt too exposed. Every little sound made me jump. I could not relax, not even for a second. Then one day I found something that pushed me to the edge. There was a box on my doorstep, no return address, no name. Inside were photos, all of me, walking to the store, working at the library, sitting in my living room. They were all taken from different angles, different days. Some were taken through my windows. I ran inside and called the police again. They came and took the photos as evidence. But without a suspect, they could not do much. I asked if I could move or get protection. They said unless there was a direct threat or assault, their hands were tied. I felt helpless, angry, and scared all at once. I started sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow. I installed a security system and motion sensors. I even got a dog from a local shelter, hoping it would give me some peace. It helped a little, but the fear never fully went away. Every time the dog barked, I jolted awake. Weeks passed with no new notes or photos. I began to feel like maybe the stalker had given up. Maybe they got bored or found someone else. I did not want to think about that last part. I just wanted my life back. I tried to return to a normal routine again. I started going out with friends again just during the day. I got back into working out, joined a group class for safety. I even went to the movies once. I wanted to believe it was over. I kept the security system on and checked every lock twice, but I hoped I could slowly move forward. One night, my dog started barking again. I looked outside and saw nothing. The motion sensor lights were off. I checked the cameras. No movement. It happened again the next night. This time I stayed up and waited. Around 2 a.m. I saw a shadow move near the back fence. I called 911 right away and kept quiet. The police came quickly this time because I told them there was someone in my yard. They found a man hiding behind my shed. He had a small knife in his pocket and a phone filled with photos of me. They arrested him on the spot. Turns out he had been living just a few blocks away. He worked from home, had no criminal record. No one suspected a thing. He admitted during questioning that he had been watching me for months. He followed my social media, even though I had made everything private. He used software to bypass privacy settings and hacked into old devices I had thrown out. It made my skin crawl, but at least now there was proof. He was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted assault. The court issued a restraining order. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city. The landlord was kind and let me install extra locks and cameras. It took time to feel safe again. I still look over my shoulder sometimes. I still hesitate before posting anything online. But now I have a community that watches out for me. My neighbors, coworkers, and friends all check in regularly. I learned how to protect my personal data better and trust my instincts. Healing did not happen overnight. There are days when I still flinch at small noises. But there are more days now where I feel calm. I walk my dog in peace. I sip coffee without fear. I can sit in my own living room and feel safe. That feeling is something I will never take for granted again. Story 6. It started like most of our late-night drives. The roads were quiet, lit only by the occasional flickering street lamp. and the hum of the engine filled the silence between our conversations. We would talk about everything and nothing, sharing memories, stories, and dreams as the world outside slipped into darkness. There was always a calm between us during those hours, a kind of trust that only grew stronger with every passing mile. I never expected that one of those nights would change everything I thought I knew. The air felt heavier that evening. I noticed it in the way they gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, jaw clenched just enough to hint at tension. At first, I thought it was just a bad day or maybe something at work had pushed them too far. I asked if they wanted to talk, offering the kind of comfort I always did when I sensed something was wrong. They just nodded and kept their eyes on the road, like they were building up the courage to say something important. We drove in silence for a while, the city slowly fading into the background as we headed toward the outskirts. The road narrowed and trees lined both sides, casting long shadows that danced across the windshield. I reached over and turned down the radio, hoping to break the silence gently, waiting for them to speak. Then they let out a long breath, like they were finally ready to unburden themselves. What they said next took the air from my lungs. They told me they had done something terrible, something they had never told anyone before. At first, I thought they were exaggerating, maybe trying to shock me or release some kind of guilt over a mistake. But their voice was steady, serious, and empty of anything that resembled a joke. I asked what they meant, needing to hear it clearly, even though my gut already knew it was something real. They told me they had killed someone. Just like that. The words hit harder than anything I had ever heard. I could not speak for a moment, frozen in place, my hand still resting on the edge of my seat. My heart started to race, and I struggled to make sense of what I had just heard. They kept talking, like once the first truth was out, they could not stop the rest from spilling. It had happened a few years ago, long before we met, in a situation they claimed had spiraled out of control. They described it as a moment of anger and panic, a fight that went too far. It was someone they knew, someone who had hurt them in the past, but I could tell the memory haunted them. They told me it was not planned. They had not woken up that day expecting to end a life. It just happened, they said, like something inside them snapped, and before they knew it, the other person was gone. I listened, barely breathing, as they explained how they had hidden it, how they had lived with it every day since. There was no trial, no report, nothing that ever pointed to them. I asked them why they were telling me now, why choose this night, this drive, to finally say it out loud. They said they could not carry it anymore, not while trying to build something honest between us. I could hear the pain in their voice, a part of them hoping I would understand, maybe even forgive. But my mind was spinning, trying to process what it meant to be sitting next to someone who had taken a life. I stared out the window, unable to meet their eyes. The rest of the drive passed in a haze. I kept thinking about all the times we had laughed together, all the soft moments that made me believe in them. I remembered how kind they had been to strangers, how gentle they were with me, and it clashed violently with what I had just learned. I wanted to believe they were still that person, but the weight of their confession hung between us like a thick fog. I said I needed time to think, and they respected that. I did not go home that night. I asked to be dropped off at a nearby gas station, pretending I needed something inside. They looked hurt, but they nodded, and I stepped out without looking back. I waited until they drove off before calling a friend to come pick me up. I did not tell anyone what had happened. I just said I was not feeling well and needed to clear my head. The following days were difficult. I avoided their messages, unsure of what to say, unsure of what I even felt. Part of me was terrified, not just for myself, but for what it meant to be connected to them. Another part of me felt sympathy, not for what they did, but for how deeply it had scarred them. I wrestled with my thoughts, flipping between anger, confusion, and an aching sadness. Eventually, I agreed to meet again. We sat in a public park, surrounded by people, the open air a buffer for whatever might come. They apologized again, not for what happened in the past, but for dropping it on me the way they did. They said they were prepared for me to leave, that they knew most people would not stay after something like that. I told them I had not made up my mind yet. I asked every question I could think of. I wanted details, timelines, emotions, regrets. They answered everything, never once trying to hide or soften the truth. They admitted what they did was wrong, that there was no excuse for it, no matter how much pain they had felt at the time. They had considered turning themselves in more than once, but always stopped at the last moment, afraid of what would happen, afraid of losing everything. We kept talking over the next few weeks. Slowly, I began to understand more about who they were now versus who they had been then. I saw how the guilt had shaped them, how it kept them awake at night, how it pushed them to be better in every part of their life. They did not ask for forgiveness. They just wanted to be seen for who they were now, not just for what they had done. It took me months to decide what I wanted. I spoke to a counselor, journaled every thought, replayed every conversation we ever had. I thought about what it meant to love someone who had once been capable of something so dark. I thought about whether people could truly change, whether redemption was real or just something we told ourselves to sleep at night. In the end, I realized something simple and clear. I could not change what happened, and neither could they. But I could choose what I believed in now. I believed in second chances, in the possibility of growth, in the power of truth. I believed that if someone was willing to carry the weight of their actions and spend every day trying to be better, maybe they deserved a chance at peace. So I chose to stay, not because I forgot what they had done, but because I saw the person they were becoming. We continued driving at night, but now with nothing hidden between us. Every mile was a quiet act of healing, every shared silence filled with the knowledge of what we had survived together. There were still hard days, but we faced them honestly, without fear. I never stopped being cautious, but I also never stopped loving. In the end, it was not about forgetting the past, but learning how to move forward from it. Story 7. It happened late one evening as I was walking home from work. I had taken a shortcut through a quiet street lined with old houses and dim streetlights. The neighborhood was usually calm at that hour, with only the distant hum of cars and the occasional barking dog. I liked the solitude most nights because it helped me clear my head after a long shift. But that night was different, and I felt it before anything even happened. There was a van parked on the side of the road, engine running but no lights on. I did not think much of it at first, figuring someone was either lost or waiting for someone. As I walked past, I heard shuffling behind me, followed by a muffled voice. I slowed down, trying to pretend I was checking my phone, even though the screen was blank. That was when I saw two people struggling near a fence up ahead. One of them was clearly trying to get away, hands flailing, while the other was holding on tightly, dragging them toward the van. I froze in place. My body refused to move, and I felt rooted to the spot like my feet were cemented into the ground. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, but all I could do was watch. I could not see their faces clearly, only their silhouettes under the dim glow of a street lamp. The door of the van slid open, and the person being dragged let out a sharp cry before being thrown inside. It was a terrible sound, one that echoed in my ears long after it stopped. The other person jumped in quickly, and the van sped off down the street with no headlights, disappearing into the darkness like it had never been there. I was still standing there, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick to my stomach. I kept telling myself to call for help, to report what I saw, but fear wrapped around my chest like a vice. What if they had seen me too? What if they came back for me? I was alone out there, and I had no idea who those people were or what they were capable of. So I did nothing. I turned around and walked the rest of the way home, faster than I ever had before, without looking back. When I got home, I locked every door and closed every curtain. I sat on the couch with all the lights off, trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, telling them what I had witnessed, but I could not bring myself to do it. I kept imagining them asking me questions I could not answer. I had no names, no plate number, no clear description of faces. The guilt hit me almost immediately, stronger than I expected. I had seen someone being taken against their will, and I had done nothing to stop it. I could not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same scene replay over and over again. I felt like a coward, ashamed that fear had kept me silent when someone needed help. For days, I avoided watching the news or checking online updates. I was terrified I would see something that confirmed my worst fear. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched for any local reports of missing persons. There was nothing. No alerts, no family members pleading for answers, no mention of a van or a kidnapping. I told myself maybe I had misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe it was just an argument or something else I did not understand. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. It was not just my imagination playing tricks on me. That person was taken, and I had stood by and let it happen. Weeks passed, and still there were no signs of anything related to that night. I went about my days like nothing had happened, smiling when needed and focusing on work. But at night, I kept thinking about that moment. It haunted me, sitting in the back of my mind, whispering reminders of my inaction. I started walking different routes to and from work, avoiding that street entirely. Every time I passed a van that looked remotely similar, my stomach would twist in knots. I knew I could not go on like that forever. The weight of what I had witnessed and my failure to act was too heavy to carry alone. One night, while I was out at a small corner store, I overheard someone talking about a girl who had gone missing nearby. It was not on the news, but it had started to circulate among locals. They said it happened around the same time I had seen the abduction. My heart sank. I knew then that I had to do something. The next morning, I forced myself to walk into the local police station. My palms were sweating, and I kept rehearsing what to say in my head. I sat in front of an officer and told them everything I could remember. I admitted I had not come forward sooner because I was scared. I described the van, the location, the time, and every small detail I could recall. To my surprise, the officer did not judge me. He thanked me for coming in and said every bit of information helped. He took my statement and assured me they would look into it. I left the station feeling lighter than I had in weeks. It was not much, but at least I had done the right thing, even if it was late. A few days later, they contacted me again to clarify some parts of my statement. They said there had been a similar vehicle spotted by a traffic camera in the area. It was a small lead, but they were following up on it. I still did not know if it would lead to anything, but I hoped it would. I wanted the person who had been taken to be found. I wanted to believe it was not too late. Over time, I started to forgive myself. I had made a mistake by staying silent, but I had also tried to fix it. Fear is powerful, but it does not have to control everything. I had let it win once, but not again. If I ever saw something like that happen in the future, I would not hesitate. I would act. I kept checking in with the police every now and then, hoping for news. One afternoon, they told me the van had been found abandoned in another city. Inside, there were traces of someone having been there recently. It was not a resolution, but it meant the investigation was moving forward. The case was still open, but now there was a real chance of solving it. In the weeks that followed, they found more clues: surveillance footage, witness statements, and eventually a suspect. The pieces started coming together, and it led to a breakthrough. The missing person was found alive. They had managed to escape and had been in hiding out of fear. They were reunited with their family, and the suspect was taken into custody. When I heard the news, I cried. Relief, guilt, and gratitude all came rushing out at once. I had not saved them that night, but maybe what I remembered helped bring them back. I realized then that speaking up, no matter how late, could still make a difference. It did not erase what happened, but it brought some justice and hope. I never got to meet the person who had been taken. I did not want recognition or praise. I only wanted to know they were safe, and they were. That was enough for me. I still think about that night sometimes, but it does not haunt me the way it used to. Now, I pay more attention to my surroundings. I trust my instincts, and I do not ignore them. If I ever witness something again, I know exactly what I will do. I will act, no matter how afraid I am, because someone else's life might depend on it. Story 8. It started when I decided to finally clear out the dense brush growing at the far end of my backyard. I had always meant to do it, but life kept getting in the way. The ground back there was uneven, and the weeds had grown so thick it looked like a miniature jungle. I brought out a shovel and some gloves, figuring I could spend a few hours just clearing the surface. As I began digging out a stubborn root, my shovel hit something solid buried under the dirt. The sound was hollow, not like rock or pipe, but more like a wooden thud. I brushed away the soil with my hands and uncovered what looked like the corner of an old wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, weathered and darkened from time. It had no lock, just a rusted hinge that creaked loudly as I opened it. Inside was a notebook, its leather cover stained and frayed at the edges. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The pages were yellowed, some sticking together from moisture, others brittle and cracked. At first, I thought it was just an old journal, maybe forgotten by whoever lived here before me. I flipped it open and was immediately unsettled by what I saw. Page after page was filled with rough pencil sketches, some barely legible, others painfully detailed. The drawings showed people with distorted faces, mouths opened in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. Some were posed in strange positions, limbs twisted in ways that defied anatomy. Between the drawings were names written in shaky handwriting, each name underlined. I did not recognize any of them, but something about them felt wrong. Some of the pages had dates next to the names, going back decades. As I turned the pages, the drawings became more disturbing. One image showed a group of figures standing in a circle around a fire. Their faces were blurred, but the flames cast shadows that made them look menacing. Another page showed a house, eerily similar to mine, drawn from the same angle as if someone had stood where I was now. The details matched perfectly, down to the broken fence panel near the corner. That was when my stomach dropped. The next few pages had names crossed out with red ink. Red ink splattered like blood across the page, as if in a fit of rage. One name was circled several times, with a date next to it that matched the current week. The implication made my hands tremble. It felt as if I had uncovered something meant to stay hidden, something dangerous. I wanted to throw the notebook away, to bury it again, and forget I had ever seen it. But curiosity clawed at me. I needed to know what it meant, why it was buried, and who had written it. I brought it inside and placed it on my kitchen table. The pages stared at me, taunting me with their grim content. That night, I could not sleep. My thoughts kept drifting to the notebook. I thought about the names, the faces in the drawings, the twisted limbs. What kind of person created something like that? And why behind my house? I got out of bed around 3 a.m. and went back to the notebook. I flipped to the back pages, hoping for some clue about its origins. Instead, I found something even more disturbing. One of the last pages had a list of addresses. Mine was one of them. It was written clearly, the handwriting the same as in the rest of the book. A chill ran down my spine as I double-checked, hoping it was some strange coincidence. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I went about my work, stayed busy, kept the television on in the background. But I could feel the notebook's presence even when I was not in the same room. It felt like a shadow had fallen over my house. I locked it in a drawer, but that did not help. Strange things began happening over the next few days. I would hear footsteps on the stairs when I was alone. Lights flickered even after I changed the bulbs. I found dirt on the floor near the back door, even though I had cleaned it. It was as if something had followed the notebook into my home. One evening, just after 7 p.m., I heard a knock on my back door. I looked through the window but saw no one. The yard was empty, the sun just beginning to set. I opened the door cautiously and saw nothing but the wind moving through the grass. But when I looked down, there was a piece of paper on the ground. It was a torn page from the notebook. A new drawing had been added. It showed a person standing at a door, my door, with eyes wide in fear. I felt a surge of panic and brought the page inside, comparing it to the rest. The style matched perfectly. The ink was still fresh. I decided I could not keep the notebook any longer. I needed to get rid of it. I drove to a park far away from my neighborhood and tossed it into a dumpster. It felt like a relief, like I had finally rid myself of whatever curse came with it. I drove home feeling lighter. But the peace did not last. That night, the same page I had thrown out appeared on my kitchen table. I had locked every door and window. There was no sign of a break-in. I searched every corner of the house, but nothing else seemed out of place. The idea that something could enter my home without a trace terrified me. The drawings began to appear more frequently. They were not always in the notebook anymore. Sometimes they were slipped under my door, sometimes placed on my pillow. Each time they showed more detailed images of my house, my daily routine, even my face. It was like someone was watching me constantly. I finally decided to report it. I went to the local station and brought the notebook, which had mysteriously returned to my kitchen drawer. I explained everything, showed the officers the pages, the names, the addresses. They took it seriously, at least at first. But after a few days, they told me there was no evidence of any crimes connected to the names. Many of the names had no records at all. I was told to contact a historian in town who specialized in local archives. I made an appointment and brought the notebook. The historian looked through the pages carefully, noting the style of handwriting and the dates. He confirmed that several of the names matched individuals who had gone missing over the years, but nothing had ever been proven. The drawings matched the style of old folklore, something people used to believe in during times of hardship. He advised me to keep the notebook in a sealed box and bury it again. Not because of evidence or crime, but because of old superstitions. Sometimes, he said, certain objects carry a weight. Not supernatural, but psychological. And that weight can affect the person who carries it. I followed his advice. I went back to the same spot where I first found the notebook. I placed it in a metal box this time, sealed tightly. I buried it deeper than before, covering the hole with heavy stones and fresh soil. As I stood there, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The strange occurrences stopped. No more drawings, no more footsteps, no more flickering lights. My house felt like my own again. I cleaned every room, aired out the windows, let in the sunlight. Weeks passed without incident. Now I look at that part of the yard with a different feeling. Well, not fear, but acceptance. I do not know who buried the notebook or why it was filled with such darkness. But I do know that some things are not meant to be uncovered. Some things are better left to rest. I spend more time in my yard now. I planted a small tree where I buried the notebook, something to bring life to that space. Every morning I water it and feel at peace. Whatever weight the notebook carried is no longer mine. I moved on, and my life returned to the way it was. Story 9. It started out as an ordinary morning with a full tank of gas and a long list of deliveries. I had already made 3 successful drop-offs by the time I reached the 4th address. It was a large 2-story house on the edge of a quiet residential neighborhood with a black iron gate and high hedges surrounding the yard. Everything about it looked normal at first glance, but I felt something strange in my gut as I pulled up the driveway. I brushed off the feeling, thinking it was just fatigue from the previous night's work. I parked the van and grabbed the medium-sized box labeled fragile. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly open, which was unusual but not unheard of. I rang the bell anyway, hoping someone would come to greet me properly. A voice from inside called out for me to come in and leave the package on the table near the entrance. It felt off, but I did not want to waste time questioning instructions when I had so many more stops to make. I stepped inside carefully, wiping my shoes on the rug just beyond the threshold. The house smelled of something floral, artificial, and slightly overpowering. The entrance opened up into a dimly lit hallway with thick carpets and heavy curtains that blocked the daylight. I saw the table and gently placed the box down, then turned to leave. As I reached for the door, I heard it slam shut behind me with a loud click. At first, I thought the wind had pulled it closed, but when I tried to open it, the knob would not turn. I jiggled it a few times, then pulled with more force, but it was locked tight. My heart rate picked up as I tried to stay calm and knocked on the door, calling out for someone to open it. No one responded. I walked back toward the hallway, hoping to find another exit or at least someone to explain what was going on. I moved deeper into the house, calling out louder now, trying not to let panic set in. The layout was confusing, with oddly placed doors and long corridors that led to empty rooms. I checked the windows, but most were either bolted shut or sealed behind those thick curtains. I found a small kitchen and tried the back door, but it was also locked. I started to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in on me, and the silence made it worse. Eventually, I heard footsteps upstairs and ran toward the staircase, relief washing over me. I shouted for help, saying I was just a delivery driver and had accidentally gotten locked in. The footsteps paused, then continued as if whoever it was had ignored me completely. I climbed the stairs quickly and followed the sound, but every door I tried was locked or led to another empty room. My calls turned into demands, then into pleas. I sat on the edge of a dusty sofa in what seemed to be a guest room, trying to figure out what to do next. My phone had no signal, which made things even more frustrating. I considered breaking a window, but most of them were reinforced or too small to climb through. It started to feel like I had been lured inside intentionally. That thought made me stand up and check every possible way out once again, hoping I had missed something. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way, and the daylight began to fade behind the curtains. I tried pacing to keep calm and to stay alert, knowing that panic would only make things worse. Eventually, I heard a noise again from upstairs, this time closer. I followed the sound until I came to a door that was cracked open. I pushed it gently and saw a figure sitting at the far end of the room. I took a step inside, hoping this person would finally explain something or help me out. They did not turn around, just sat there in a rocking chair facing the window. I cleared my throat and asked if I could get help with the front door. The person shifted slightly, then reached for something beside the chair without looking at me. A moment later, the lights in the hallway flickered, and I heard a soft mechanical noise. I stepped back, unsure what had just happened. When I returned to the main hallway, the front door was wide open. I did not hesitate. I ran toward it, my footsteps thudding loudly on the carpeted floor. I burst out into the daylight and stumbled down the steps toward my van. I looked back once, and the door was closed again, as if none of it had happened. I climbed into the van, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute catching my breath. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The address on the delivery list burned into my memory, and I made a mental note never to return there again. I did not report it because I had no solid explanation and no evidence. All I knew was that I had entered a house for a simple delivery and nearly did not come back out. The rest of the day passed in a blur as I finished the remaining deliveries. Every house I approached after that, I stayed outside and knocked, refusing to step into anyone's home again. Even the friendly customers seemed suspicious to me now. I kept checking the locks on my van, my surroundings, everything. The thought of being trapped again made me more cautious with every move I made. That night I could not sleep. I kept replaying the moment the door slammed and the silence that followed. It was not just the fear of being locked in, but the way the house seemed to swallow me whole. The presence of someone upstairs who never spoke, never moved, except to unlock the door from somewhere else. I tried to tell myself it was all just a misunderstanding, maybe even a prank, but deep down I did not believe that. Days passed, and I eventually got back to my routine. I told a few friends about what had happened, though I left out some of the more unnerving parts. Most of them laughed it off, or said I must have imagined the worst. But I knew what I felt. I knew the fear was real, and that it changed the way I approached my job from then on. I double-checked every instruction, every address, every doorway. I started carrying a small toolkit in my van, just in case I needed to break out of somewhere again. It gave me a bit of comfort to know I would not be so helpless next time. I also added a tracking app on my phone that shared my location with a friend during every delivery. If anything ever went wrong again, someone would know where I was. That gave me some peace of mind. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it all the time. Life went on, and the strange experience faded into the back of my memory. It became just another story I carried with me, something I survived and learned from. The job continued, and I still made deliveries, though more carefully now. The fear became something manageable, not something that ruled me. Over time, I came to appreciate how lucky I was to have gotten out. Whatever the reason behind what happened that day, I did not let it break me. I used the fear to sharpen my instincts, to protect myself better. Every step I took afterward felt more cautious, but also more grounded. I did not stop living or working. I just learned how to keep moving forward. Story 10. When I first stepped into the apartment, I felt relief more than anything. It had taken weeks of searching and a long chain of paperwork, but finally I had a place of my own. The space was small but cozy, tucked on the third floor of an old building with creaky steps and chipped paint. The landlord had warned me that the building had its quirks, but I did not mind. I was looking forward to the peace and solitude, away from noise and people. The first few days went by smoothly as I unpacked and tried to make the space feel like home. I arranged my furniture, hung some photos, and stocked the fridge with groceries. Everything seemed fine, though I kept noticing a faint musty odor that I could not quite place. It was not strong, just persistent, like damp wood or old water damage. I chalked it up to the building's age and tried not to think much of it. Late one evening, as I was setting up a shelf in the corner of the living room, I noticed a loose floorboard. It creaked differently from the others, sounding hollow beneath my feet. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pry it up, expecting to find maybe an old pipe or forgotten trinket. Instead, I saw something dark staining the wood underneath. At first, I thought it was water damage, but as I looked closer, my stomach turned. The stain was reddish-brown, dried in streaks and puddles across the subfloor. It looked too thick to be anything but blood. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but then I hesitated. Calling someone felt drastic. There was no body, no clear evidence of a crime, just this unsettling stain in an old building. I lowered my phone and took a few steps back, unsure of what to do next. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, staring at that corner of the floor. My mind went in circles, trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was from an animal. Maybe a previous tenant had injured themselves. The possibilities did not comfort me. The more I tried to justify it, the worse I felt. The next morning, I decided to clean the stain myself. I put on gloves, got some cleaning supplies, and set to work scrubbing the dark patch. No matter what I used, the stain would not come up. It was soaked deep into the wood, like it had been there for a long time. The more I scrubbed, the more I noticed there were smaller stains nearby, as if someone had tried to cover them with fresh boards. I stopped cleaning and sat back on my heels, sweating despite the cool air. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts raced. I considered asking the landlord about it, but something told me he would not be honest. The apartment was cheap for a reason, and I began to wonder if this was it. Maybe others had seen the same thing and chosen to leave. That evening, I could not sleep. Every sound in the apartment made me jump. The creak of the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, even the wind brushing against the windows made my skin crawl. I kept glancing at the floor, convinced that if I blinked too long, something would change. The shadows seemed darker than usual, and the silence felt heavy. A few days passed, and I tried to ignore the stain. I put the board back over it and arranged a rug to cover that section of the floor. Still, I felt uneasy. The smell returned, stronger than before, and it clung to the air no matter how much I cleaned. I opened windows, burned candles, even bought an air purifier, but nothing helped. I started having strange dreams, vivid and disturbing. In one, I was standing in the living room, and the floorboards were soaked in fresh blood, seeping up between the cracks. In another, I heard muffled cries coming from beneath the floor, growing louder until I woke up gasping for breath. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear clung to me during the day too. One afternoon, while reorganizing the closet, I found a small metal box tucked behind some loose insulation. Inside were old photographs and a few pieces of paper. The photos were faded, but some showed people inside the apartment standing right where I now kept my couch. The one paper looked like a letter written in shaky handwriting. It spoke of voices, blood, and a feeling of being watched. The final line said, "I have to get out before it takes me too." I dropped the letter and backed out of the closet, heart racing. I did not want to believe it, but the feeling in my gut told me something terrible had happened here. The letter was old, but the emotions behind the words still felt fresh. I considered moving out right then, but I had nowhere else to go. I had spent most of my savings to move in, and breaking the lease would cost more than I could afford. The following week, I tried to spend as little time at home as possible. I stayed out late, wandered the neighborhood, even sat at coffee shops until closing. Still, every night I had to return, and each time I stepped through the door, the air felt heavier. The stain seemed darker, the silence deeper. I tried to ignore it, tried to act normal, but the tension wore on me. One night around 2 a.m. I heard a loud crash from the living room. I jumped out of bed and ran out, heart pounding. The rug had shifted, and the loose floorboard was out of place again. I stared at it, my hands shaking. I walked over slowly, bent down, and pulled the board up once more. This time I saw something new. Nestled between the joists was a piece of cloth, dark and stiff with dried blood. I backed away and sat down hard on the floor, unable to breathe. This was no longer just a stain. Something horrible had happened here, and someone had tried to cover it up. I thought about calling the police, but again I hesitated. What would I tell them? There was no proof of a crime, just old stains and strange feelings. I felt trapped between fear and helplessness. The next morning I called a local historian, someone who had written about the neighborhood's older buildings. I asked about my apartment, casually at first, but as we spoke I revealed more details. After a pause, the man told me that years ago, there had been an incident in the building. A tenant had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. No one was ever charged, and the case went cold. The pieces began to fall into place. The stain, the photos, the letter, the cloth. Someone had suffered here, and their story had been buried along with the evidence. I felt a deep sadness more than fear now. I decided that if no one else would speak for them, I would. I documented everything I had found, took photos, and wrote down everything I had experienced since moving in. I reached out to a local journalist who had covered old unsolved cases. She listened to me without judgment and asked to see what I had. After reviewing the photos and letter, she agreed to look into it. A few weeks later, she published a piece about forgotten crimes and hidden truths, featuring my apartment and the evidence I had discovered. The story gained attention, and investigators reopened the case. A team eventually searched beneath the floor and found more items, including a small bone fragment. DNA tests confirmed it belonged to the missing tenant. The case finally had answers, and the victim was laid to rest with dignity. I felt a strange peace settle over the apartment after that. The stain never faded, but the air no longer felt heavy. I stayed a few more months before finding a new place. When I left, I did not look back. I carried the memory with me, not as a horror story, but as a reminder. Sometimes silence hides truth, and sometimes it only takes one person willing to listen to make a difference. Story 11. I had always known my next-door neighbor to be a bit of a mystery. At first, I thought it was just that he was a private person, and I respected that. He kept to himself, rarely engaging in conversations, and seemed to be home at odd hours. What caught my attention the most, however, was how he always wore gloves. No matter the weather, even on the hottest days of summer, he would be seen with a pair of leather gloves covering his hands. It wasn't just that he wore gloves, though. It was the way he acted around the house. I had lived next to him for a few years, and in all that time I had never heard a sound from his basement. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. The rest of the house was quiet as well, but there was an eerie silence about the basement. It wasn't that I was eavesdropping. I just happened to notice because I would hear noises from the other houses on the street, but his house was always still. One evening I noticed the basement light flickering through the window. I was standing in my kitchen when I saw the shadow of a figure moving down the stairs. I thought it was strange that he would be down there at such a late hour. I had seen him leave for work earlier in the day, but I never saw him come back. His routine seemed unpredictable, but his behavior always struck me as odd. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the nagging curiosity in my mind. I had other things to worry about: work, life, responsibilities, but every time I looked at his house, something in my gut told me there was more to his quiet existence than I was seeing. The gloves, the basement, the silence, it all seemed so deliberate. But what could it mean? Why would someone go to such lengths to be so private, even secretive? One afternoon I decided to confront him, or at least try to. I had been living next to him long enough to know that polite small talk was the best way to start a conversation. So I knocked on his door, offering a friendly smile. When he answered, he was wearing the usual pair of gloves, and he greeted me with a nod. I made some light conversation about the weather in the neighborhood, but he was short with his responses. It didn't take long for me to sense that he wasn't interested in talking. I walked away from the conversation feeling more unsettled than before. There was something in the way he looked at me, almost like he was watching me more closely than I had ever realized. Maybe it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. That night I lay awake in bed, thinking about the basement again. My mind raced with possibilities, each more bizarre than the last, but none of them seemed out of the realm of possibility. The next weekend, I took a walk around the neighborhood and found myself passing by his house. As I walked along the sidewalk, I noticed the basement window was slightly cracked open. Curiosity got the better of me, and without thinking, I took a few steps closer. I could hear muffled sounds coming from inside, but I couldn't make out what they were. It was like a faint humming noise, but nothing specific. My heart began to race, and I quickly walked away, deciding it was best not to know. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard. The following week, I had a plan. I made sure to be around when he was likely to be gone for the day, though I wasn't sure what I would do once I was in front of his house. I told myself I was just being cautious, that I needed to find out if something was wrong, that I couldn't keep living next to someone whose behavior was so strange without knowing the truth. I had to be sure. On the day I planned to act, I took a deep breath and walked over to his house. The street was quiet, and I knew the neighbors were either at work or out running errands. The basement window was still cracked open, just enough for me to slip a hand through without disturbing anything. I pressed my ear against the window, listening carefully, and the humming noise was unmistakable. It was a mechanical sound now, almost like machinery or equipment running. I took a few steps back, unsure of what to make of it. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, but I couldn't stop myself from moving closer. I found a small rock and gently knocked on the basement window, hoping to get a reaction. To my surprise, the humming stopped almost immediately, and everything went silent. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea whether he had heard me or if it was just a coincidence. A few days later, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very wrong, that I was missing something vital. I took a chance and called a local private investigator, explaining what I had observed over the past few weeks. The investigator didn't seem surprised at all, which made my nerves flare up. He agreed to help me, but only if I was prepared for the consequences. The idea of hiring someone to investigate my neighbor made me nervous, but I had to know what was going on. The investigator spent the next several days observing the house and its surroundings. He returned to me with his findings, and what he told me made my blood run cold. The basement was indeed soundproof, but not for the reasons I had imagined. Apparently, my neighbor was running a small but very sophisticated recording studio down there. It turned out that the gloves were not a sign of anything sinister, but rather a necessity for him to handle delicate equipment. However, he had been keeping the studio hidden because he had been recording unauthorized material, using sounds that weren't his to capture. The investigator shared with me that my neighbor had been involved in some illegal activities, pirating music and selling recordings. The basement was rigged with high-tech sound equipment, and the soundproofing was designed to keep the noise contained. There was more to it than I had ever suspected, and I was both relieved and horrified at what I had uncovered. I never imagined the quiet, solitary man next door was involved in something so deceptive, but I had also found out he was not dangerous in the way I had feared. In the end, the investigator reported my neighbor's activities to the authorities, and they took it from there. The man was arrested, and his operation was dismantled. While I never saw him again, I knew that his secret life had been exposed. As strange as it all was, I couldn't help but feel grateful that I had trusted my instincts, that I had listened to that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. After everything had settled, I moved on with my life, but the memory of my neighbor remained with me. It was a reminder that sometimes things aren't always as they seem. The quietest, most unassuming people could be hiding something right beneath the surface. It also taught me the importance of being aware of my surroundings, of not dismissing the small details that others might overlook. I never saw anyone else move into that house, and I never heard anything more about the man next door. But I continued to live my life with a little more awareness, knowing that the truth could sometimes be stranger than fiction. Story 12. The night started off like any typical college party: loud music, laughter, and the smell of cheap beer and cigarettes in the air. I had been looking forward to this event for days, eager to let loose after the stress of midterms. The house was packed, and there were people I knew mingling with strangers, all of us enjoying the freedom that came with a night off from schoolwork. I had a few drinks, nothing too excessive, and spent the evening talking to people, dancing, and trying to forget about the pile of assignments waiting for me. At some point, the party began to feel overwhelming, and I decided to step outside for some fresh air. I wandered into the backyard, where the noise from the party was muffled, and the cool night air calmed my nerves. It was then that someone approached me, a guy I had never seen before. He seemed friendly, offering me a drink that I initially declined, but after a bit of persuasion I accepted. The drink tasted fine, maybe a little stronger than what I was used to, but I didn't think much of it. I remember feeling a little dizzy, but I told myself it was just the alcohol. We talked for a while and the conversation was casual. After a while, I started feeling more and more detached from reality. The world around me began to blur, and everything seemed too loud, too overwhelming. The next thing I knew, I woke up in complete darkness. My body ached, and my head throbbed with a pounding headache that I couldn't shake. I tried to move but realized that I was lying on a cold, hard surface. My hands were bound behind me, and my ankles were tied together. Panic rose in my chest as I struggled to make sense of what had happened. I was no longer at the party, that much was clear, but where was I? The air smelled damp and musty, and I could hear faint noises coming from somewhere above me. I slowly turned my head, my eyes straining to adjust to the dark. I realized I was in a basement, small, cramped, and suffocating. My heart began to race as fear set in. My mind was racing with questions. How did I get here? Who did this? And most importantly, how was I going to get out? I tried to call out, but my throat was dry, and my voice barely made it past my lips. There was no response. No one answered. I forced myself to sit up, the ropes biting into my wrists as I shifted, but it was no use. I was trapped, and I had no idea where I was, or who had put me there. The basement was cold, and I could feel the dampness seeping into my clothes. I took slow, deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but the panic kept bubbling up. I needed to think clearly, to figure out a way to escape. I had to get out. I started testing the ropes around my wrists, tugging at them as hard as I could, but they were tight and didn't give at all. I couldn't even move my hands enough to untie them. Every time I pulled, the ropes dug deeper into my skin, making the pain worse. I tried to remember the events of the night, but everything was fuzzy. I couldn't recall exactly how I ended up in the basement. The last clear memory I had was of talking to that guy outside the party. I had thought he was friendly, just another stranger at the party. But now I wasn't so sure. I could feel my pulse quickening again as my thoughts spiraled. After what felt like hours of struggling, I finally managed to wriggle my hands free. The ropes were still tight, but I had somehow loosened them just enough to slip my hands out. My fingers were numb and sore, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I crawled toward the nearest wall, my legs stiff from being bound for so long. The basement was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams overhead. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady myself. The door to the basement was just a few feet away, but it looked locked. I stood up cautiously, trying not to make any noise. I had no idea if anyone was upstairs, watching me or waiting for me to make a move. My breath was shallow as I approached the door, my heart thumping in my chest. I tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged again, and I slammed my body against the door, hoping it would give way. But the door held firm. I slumped down to the floor in defeat. My mind was racing again, trying to think of any possible way out. The windows were small and high up, too high for me to reach, and there was no way to climb up. The basement was a dead end. My only hope was the door. I kept pulling at the handle, but it didn't budge. I tried to scream, but my voice was hoarse, and no sound came out. Just as I was starting to lose hope, I heard a faint noise. It was coming from above, the sound of footsteps on the floor above me. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Someone was upstairs, and I couldn't tell if they knew I was down there or if they were just moving about the house. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, hoping whoever it was wouldn't come down to the basement. Then the footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I waited, listening, trying to figure out what was going on. I could hear my own breathing in the silence. And then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had stopped, I heard a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "You're awake," the voice said. My body went cold. I didn't know who it was, but I could tell it was the same person who had been behind everything. My mind was racing again, trying to come up with something to say or do. But the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed with fear. The door to the basement creaked open, and a figure stepped into the dim light. I couldn't make out their face at first, but the outline of their body was clear. They looked like a man, but his features were obscured by shadows. I could feel the tension in the air as he stood there, watching me. For a long time, neither of us said anything. I just stared at him, my heart racing, unsure of what to do next. But then, the man spoke again. "I wasn't sure if you'd wake up," he said, his voice calm but cold. "But now that you're awake, I guess we can talk." I tried to say something, anything, but my voice was barely a whisper. The man stepped closer, his shadow growing longer across the floor. I could see the glint of something shiny in his hand, and for a moment I thought he was going to harm me. But instead, he knelt down beside me and cut the ropes around my ankles. "You don't need to be afraid," he said softly. "I wasn't going to hurt you." The words barely registered in my mind. My thoughts still scrambled from the shock and fear. But as he cut the ropes and helped me to my feet, something inside me shifted. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I wasn't going to stay there any longer. I didn't care if he was trying to reassure me or not. The man backed away slowly, giving me space. "The door's open," he said. "You can leave if you want." I didn't hesitate. I ran for the door, not looking back. I didn't know if he would try to stop me, but I didn't care. The moment I stepped outside into the fresh air, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I didn't report the incident immediately. I wasn't sure who would believe me, and I was still too shaken to explain it. But I left the party behind and never went back. The fear lingered for a long time, but I never forgot that night. I couldn't forget what it felt like to be trapped in that basement, unsure of what would happen next, and the strange man who let me go. Story 13. I had always been skeptical about dating apps, but after months of being encouraged by friends, I finally decided to give it a try. I created a profile, filled in the details, and started swiping through potential matches. Most of the people I came across seemed perfectly ordinary, but one profile stood out. His picture was casual, a simple shot of him sitting on a bench at a park, a slight smile on his face. His bio was straightforward, mentioning he enjoyed hiking, photography, and reading. I swiped right, and within minutes we matched. We started chatting almost immediately after the match, and the conversation flowed easily. He seemed charming, funny, and intelligent, with a good sense of humor. We talked about our hobbies, favorite books, and shared a few funny stories about our lives. The more we talked, the more I felt like I was connecting with someone who shared similar values. After a few days of texting, he suggested we meet in person, and I agreed. We decided to meet at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, a place known for its cozy atmosphere and excellent pastries. When I arrived, I spotted him right away sitting by the window. He stood up as I walked over, offering a warm smile and a handshake. We sat down and continued our conversation over coffee. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and I couldn't help but feel excited about the potential of this connection. He was even better in person than in his pictures. As the date went on, I learned more about his life. He told me he worked in tech, though he never went into too much detail about his job. He seemed a little private about his career, which I didn't think much of at the time. We talked about everything else, from our favorite vacations to our families. There were moments when I caught him glancing around nervously, but I brushed it off as being nothing more than a little anxiety. The date ended with a hug, and he promised to call me later that night. We kept in touch over the next few days, texting frequently and making plans to meet again. Everything seemed perfect, or at least it felt like it. But then, things started to take a strange turn. I woke up one morning to find a series of missed calls and texts from him, all sent late the previous night. The messages were a mix of apologies and requests to talk. I assumed he had simply had a rough day or was feeling stressed, so I texted him back and suggested we chat later. He responded almost immediately, asking if I would meet him again that evening. I agreed, though I felt a slight unease that I couldn't quite place. When I arrived at the coffee shop, he wasn't there. I waited for a while, checking my phone for any updates, but nothing came. After about 30 minutes, I sent him a message asking where he was. That's when he replied, telling me that he had to leave suddenly because of an emergency, but that he would explain everything soon. At this point, I started to feel like something wasn't right. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next few days were a blur of texts, phone calls, and strange messages. He apologized profusely, claiming that he had been dealing with personal issues and was under a lot of pressure. I tried to be understanding, but something about the situation felt off. His messages became increasingly erratic, sometimes apologizing, sometimes sounding agitated. The red flags were there, but I didn't want to believe it. I had already invested so much into this connection that I hoped it was just a temporary setback. Then, one evening, things took a dramatic turn. I received a message from him asking to meet again. This time, he suggested a different location, a quiet park outside of town. He said he needed to talk to me face to face about something important. Though I hesitated, my curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet him there. When I arrived, he was already waiting, sitting on a bench near the entrance. He looked different, more worn out, with dark circles under his eyes and a sense of urgency in his demeanor. He stood up as I approached, but there was something off about the way he looked at me. He didn't greet me with the usual warmth, but instead seemed tense, constantly scanning the area as if looking for something. I asked if everything was okay, and that's when he finally told me the truth. He confessed that he had been running from the law for the past few months. His name wasn't what he had told me, and his life was nothing like the one he had portrayed. He was, in fact, a fugitive, wanted for a series of crimes, some of which were serious. I was stunned, frozen in place. He begged me not to call the authorities, pleading with me to keep his secret. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was still trying to make sense of the situation. He explained that he had been trying to lay low, using dating apps to meet people and maintain some sense of normalcy. He hadn't planned on getting close to anyone, but things with me had changed that. He seemed genuinely remorseful, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. He promised he would disappear, that he would leave town and never contact me again if I just kept quiet. The offer sounded tempting in that moment, especially considering the fear that was growing in me. But I knew I couldn't keep this secret. I told him I couldn't help him, and that I was going to the authorities. His face fell, and he looked around nervously before glancing at me one last time. He started backing away slowly, saying that he didn't want to hurt me, that I wouldn't be safe if I got involved. But I had already made my decision. I turned around and left the park, my heart pounding in my chest. I immediately called the police. I gave them all the information I had, including his real name, his description, and the details he had shared with me. They assured me they would handle it from there. Within days, they had tracked him down and arrested him. The entire experience was surreal, and for a while I couldn't shake the feeling of fear and disbelief. In the end, I was grateful that I had made the right choice, even though it had been terrifying. The authorities thanked me for my cooperation, and the situation was resolved quickly. I learned an important lesson about trust and intuition. Sometimes things aren't what they seem, and it's better to listen to that nagging feeling, no matter how good the connection may seem at first. The whole experience left me shaken, but I came out stronger and more cautious. Though the incident was behind me, I couldn't help but reflect on how easily things could have gone differently. I had unknowingly matched with a fugitive, someone who had hidden their true identity and intentions. But in the end, I did the right thing, and it reminded me that sometimes even the most innocent-seeming encounters can turn out to be something entirely different. Story 14. It was an ordinary day when I received the letter. At first, I thought it was just junk mail or some other trivial thing, but as I opened it, I quickly realized it was anything but ordinary. The words written in bold, unsettling letters read, "You have no idea what you're getting into. Your decision will cost you." I froze for a moment, my mind racing. I had been selected to serve as part of the jury for a murder trial, and now this letter made it feel all too real. My hands trembled slightly as I held it, trying to make sense of what it meant. I tried to shake it off and convince myself that it was just a prank. After all, how could someone possibly know I was on the jury? The case had only just begun, and I had been careful to keep my involvement private. Still, there was an unsettling feeling in my stomach that I couldn't ignore. What if this was more than just a joke? What if I was being watched? The next day, as I went about my normal routine, I noticed something strange. I had a voicemail on my phone from an unknown number. The message was brief, and the voice on the other end was cold and threatening. "You better not make the wrong choice. We're always watching you. My heart sank. This was no coincidence. Someone knew exactly who I was and what I was doing, and they were not happy about it. I tried to remain calm, but the pressure of being involved in such a high-profile case was already starting to weigh on me. The trial had begun with intense emotions, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with tension. The prosecutor and defense attorney were both fierce in their arguments, each trying to sway the jury in their favor. But now, with the threats hanging over me, I felt like I was walking a thin line. Every time I looked over my shoulder or entered a dark alley, the thought of someone watching me crept into my mind. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I received another anonymous message. This time it was a text. If you think you're safe, think again. You won't leave this trial unscathed. My hands were shaking as I read it, and I immediately called a close friend for support. I explained everything, but they told me to be careful and that I should report it to the authorities. At the same time, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I still didn't know if this was some sort of twisted prank or a serious threat. I decided to keep the threats to myself for the time being. I didn't want to cause a scene, especially not during such a sensitive case. But as the days went on, the threats became more frequent. They came through phone calls, texts, and even emails. Each time, the language was more aggressive. It felt like I was being cornered, trapped in a situation I couldn't escape. I couldn't focus on the trial or my role in it anymore. I was too consumed by the fear of what might happen next. One evening, I was leaving the courthouse after a long day of deliberations when I noticed someone following me. At first, I thought it was just another person on the sidewalk, but as I turned the corner, they did too. My heart began to race. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps behind me grew louder. I glanced back, only to see a shadowy figure in the distance. I wasn't sure if they were following me or if it was just my imagination running wild, but either way, I felt a deep sense of unease. I reached the nearest bus stop and waited there, watching the street for any sign of danger. The figure eventually disappeared, but the fear remained. The next morning, I decided to take action. I contacted the authorities and explained the situation. They took me seriously and assured me they would look into it, but I still felt uneasy. The idea that someone was targeting me and knew so much about my life, my whereabouts, and my involvement in the trial was terrifying. I had always considered myself a private person, and now that privacy was being violated in the most unsettling way possible. The police advised me to be cautious and to continue with the trial, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started taking different routes to and from the courthouse, hoping to avoid anyone who might be following me. But even that wasn't enough. It felt like the walls were closing in. I couldn't tell who was responsible for the threats, but the thought of making the wrong decision in the trial haunted me. I was terrified that if I didn't rule in favor of the right person, I might face even worse consequences. The jury deliberations became more intense as the trial progressed. The defendant was a man accused of a heinous crime, and the evidence was overwhelming. Still, the pressure of the threats weighed heavily on me. Every word I said in the jury room was met with scrutiny. Every decision I made felt like it could be the wrong one. But I knew I had to stay focused and do my duty. The last thing I wanted was for the person threatening me to think they had control over my actions. One night, after another threat had come through my phone, I decided to install security cameras around my apartment. I felt paranoid, but it gave me a small sense of security. I made sure to double lock all my doors and windows, and I never went anywhere without telling someone where I was going. My life was becoming consumed by the trial and the fear that came with it. I knew I needed to stay strong, but it was hard to remain calm when I wasn't sure if someone was waiting for me to make a mistake. Then, one morning, as I arrived at the courthouse, I was met by a police officer. He informed me that they had tracked down the source of the threats. It turned out that the person behind the anonymous messages had been using a burner phone, and their identity was still unknown. The officer explained that they had managed to trace the number to a local area, but beyond that, they were still investigating. I felt a small sense of relief, knowing that at least someone was taking it seriously and working to protect me. But I also knew the threat wasn't over yet. The days that followed were tense, but the authorities assured me they were monitoring the situation closely. I continued to serve on the jury, keeping my head down and my decisions focused on the facts. The trial finally reached its conclusion, and the verdict was read aloud. The defendant was found guilty, and as the courtroom emptied, I felt a sense of both relief and dread. It was over, but the threat still loomed. In the weeks that followed, the police made an arrest. They had tracked down the individual responsible for the threats, someone with a personal connection to the case. I was shocked to learn that the person had been trying to intimidate the jury to influence the outcome of the trial. Our plan had failed, but I couldn't help but feel disturbed by the lengths someone was willing to go to. The police assured me that the person would face serious charges for their actions. As time went on, I began to feel safer, but the experience had changed me. I had learned just how fragile our sense of security can be. I couldn't take for granted the simple act of living my life without fear. The trial had been a burden, but it also taught me a valuable lesson about courage, resilience, and the importance of standing up to threats. In the end, I was proud of the decision I had made as a juror. I had stuck to my values, despite the pressure and fear. The outcome was just, and the person responsible for the threats would face the consequences of their actions. It was a relief to know that justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in my own life as well. Story 15. It started as a typical ride, just another busy evening in the city. I had ordered a rideshare to get home after a long day of work. I was exhausted, my mind filled with the usual thoughts of errands and tasks for the next day. The car pulled up quickly, and I climbed into the back seat, grateful that I could finally relax for a few minutes. The driver greeted me politely, and I settled in, looking forward to the short journey ahead. The car started moving smoothly through the streets, and I leaned back, half closing my eyes. The night was dark, with the city lights flashing by, and the music in the car was soft, almost soothing. I tried to let go of the stress from my day and focused on the comforting hum of the car's engine. I checked my phone briefly, responding to a couple of quick messages, and then returned to just staring out the window, letting the ride take me home. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The driver was quiet, and the ride felt just like any other I had taken before. He took the same route that most drivers would take to get to my neighborhood. As we got closer to my destination, I thought nothing of it when he made a turn I wasn't expecting. I hadn't been paying close attention, but the unfamiliar turn caught my eye. I glanced at the map on my phone, but it still showed the route leading to my house. I thought maybe he just knew a quicker way. I didn't immediately feel alarmed, but then something shifted. The further we drove, the less familiar the area became. I looked out the window and saw dark, empty streets, the kind of streets I never usually traveled on. I checked the map again, my heart beginning to race. We were definitely going in the wrong direction. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just a mistake. "Hey, you missed my turn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you turn around and go back?" The driver didn't respond, his eyes still fixed on the road. I repeated myself, louder this time, more insistent. The car slowed for a moment, and I thought maybe he was considering my request, but then it sped up again. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I looked around nervously, trying to get my bearings. I had been in this area a few times, but it was rare, and I certainly hadn't come this far out before. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no other cars on the road, and the few street lights that were working flickered intermittently. I started to feel a sense of panic creeping up, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was just lost, or maybe this was the quickest way to get to my destination. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But then the car started to speed up, and I noticed the driver's expression in the rearview mirror. His face was tense, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't looking at me, but I could tell something was wrong. My gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. "Where are you taking me?" I demanded, my voice trembling slightly. This time he didn't answer at all. Instead, he took another turn, and I recognized that we were moving further away from my neighborhood. "Stop the car. I need to get out now," I yelled, my voice growing louder and more frantic. My palms were sweaty, and I could feel my body stiffening with fear. The driver still didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge me. I reached for the door handle, trying to open it, but it was locked. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed at the door harder, pulling it, shaking it, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel my breath quickening, my mind racing as I realized how trapped I was. "Let me out," I screamed, my voice filled with desperation. I tried to stay calm, but my body was already reacting to the threat. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands shaking. I reached for my phone, but my fingers were trembling so badly that it took me several attempts to unlock it. When I finally did, I quickly dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos I felt inside. I could barely keep my voice steady as I spoke. "I'm in a rideshare, and the driver won't let me out. He's taking me somewhere I don't recognize. Please help me." "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "We've got your location. Help is on the way. Is there any way for you to get out or to stop the car?" I looked at the driver, who still hadn't said a word. I could feel my chest tightening as I struggled to think. My hands were slick with sweat, and I knew I had to stay focused. "No, he's locked the doors. I can't get out." "Stay on the line with me," the dispatcher said. "Help is coming, but you need to keep calm. If you can, try to get a description of the driver." I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I glanced at the driver once again, trying to observe as much as I could without drawing attention to myself. He was wearing a baseball cap, and his face was mostly obscured by the shadows, but I could see his lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't even looking at the road anymore. He was staring straight ahead, his grip on the steering wheel tight. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. I didn't know what this driver's intentions were, but my instincts screamed that I was in danger. I heard the sound of my breath coming out in short gasps. "Where are you taking me?" I asked again, my voice shaky. This time he only increased the speed, ignoring me completely. I could feel my phone vibrating in my hand, a new notification coming through. It was a message from the rideshare app, asking if everything was okay. It felt like a cruel joke as I typed back, "No, I'm in danger. The driver won't let me out." I sent the message before my phone slipped from my hand, my anxiety building to an unbearable level. As we continued to drive, I saw a car's headlights appear in the distance. It was the first car I had seen on this road, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe help was finally close. But before I could feel any relief, the driver turned off onto a smaller road that led into the woods. The headlights of the car ahead of us disappeared as we veered off the main road. I felt a surge of terror. There were no other cars, no lights, and no way to escape. I could hear the faint sound of my heartbeat in my ears, louder than the engine. "Stop the car." I shouted again, but the driver didn't respond. I could feel the panic setting in again, a wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. Suddenly the car slowed and I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. My heart skipped a beat and I forced myself to calm down. The driver seemed to notice the sirens too, and he took a sharp turn, heading toward an abandoned building. I could see the flashing lights in my rearview mirror, but I didn't know if they were for us or someone else. I braced myself, hoping that the police were close enough to catch us. Just as the driver was about to pull into a dark alley behind the building, a police car blocked the entrance. Officers quickly got out of their vehicle, guns drawn, shouting at the driver to stop. The tension in the air was palpable as the driver froze, realizing he had nowhere to go. The officers approached the car cautiously, and after a tense few moments they opened the door and pulled him out. They arrested him on the spot. I was shaken, but I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The officers assured me that I was safe and quickly escorted me to their car. I gave my statement, my hands still trembling from the ordeal. I didn't know what the driver's intentions were, but I was glad that I would never have to find out. The police were able to trace his background, and it turned out that he had been involved in several similar incidents. His actions were calculated, and it was clear that he had been stalking riders for weeks. I later learned that he had a history of making other passengers feel uncomfortable, but he had never gone this far before. Afterward, I took some time to process everything. The fear lingered for a while, but I knew I was lucky to have escaped unharmed. The experience left me more cautious and aware, but I also felt empowered. I had been able to keep calm and reach out for help when I needed it most. I would never take my safety for granted again, and I would always trust my instincts from that day forward. Story 16. The alleyway was quiet, the kind of quiet that made me feel uneasy as I walked along it. It was a place I had passed many times before, but tonight something felt off. The street lights flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. I was on my way home, but a small noise from behind a dumpster caught my attention, making me stop. Curiosity won over caution, and I found myself walking toward the sound, half expecting to find a stray cat or something equally insignificant. Instead, I found a backpack lying discarded in the corner of the alley. It was weathered, beaten up, as if it had been thrown there in a hurry. I looked around quickly, wondering who might have dropped it, but the street was empty. No cars, no people, just the soft echo of my footsteps and the distant hum of the city. I was alone, and the only sound now was my heart beating faster as I approached the bag. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to see what was inside. I crouched down and carefully opened the backpack. The zipper caught slightly, but it eventually gave way, revealing a mess of papers, a few old receipts, and something that looked out of place, a stack of identification cards. I froze for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. Each ID was from a different person, but they all looked identical in one respect: they were fake. They had the same level of detail as a real ID, but there was something off about them, the kind of thing you would notice if you looked closely enough. I picked up one of the IDs, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned it over. The name and details on the card looked real enough, but the photo was blurry, almost too perfect to be authentic. As I sifted through the pile, I realized they weren't just a few random IDs. There were dozens of them, maybe more, each one belonging to a different person, each one a fake. I had no idea why they were all here, in a backpack in the middle of a dark alleyway, but something told me this wasn't just a simple case of someone losing their belongings. Along with the IDs, there were several burner phones stuffed into the bag. They were wrapped in a plastic bag, as though the person who owned them had wanted to keep them separate from the rest of the contents. I took one out cautiously, examining it closely. It was a cheap, no-name brand, the kind that only existed for a few months before being replaced with something newer. I turned it on, hoping to find a clue about its owner or its purpose, but there was nothing. No contacts, no messages, just a blank screen, waiting for a signal. I looked around again, wondering if someone had been watching me. The air seemed heavier now, thick with the weight of what I had just found. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was I in danger for finding this? Was this some sort of setup? But I didn't want to leave just yet. Something told me that I had stumbled onto something much bigger than just a lost backpack. It was a risk, but I couldn't just walk away without knowing more. I took the burner phones and IDs out of the bag one by one, trying to figure out if there was any connection between them. Each phone was different. Each one had its own unique set of numbers, but none of them had been used recently. The IDs seemed to have the same purpose. Each one was just a piece of someone else's identity, carefully crafted and easily replaced. There were no clear answers, just more questions piling up in my mind, each one darker than the last. I put everything back into the bag and stood up, looking around the alley one more time. It was still quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I thought about calling the police, but something made me hesitate. What would I tell them? Would they even believe me? Or would they just brush it off as some kind of prank? No, I needed more information before involving anyone else. I couldn't just hand this over without understanding what it all meant. The decision weighed on me for a while, but in the end I knew I couldn't just leave the backpack there. I had to find out who owned it, who had been using the fake IDs, and why the burner phones were so important. So I did what seemed like the most logical thing at the time. I took the bag with me and walked home, hoping that by morning I would have a better idea of what I was dealing with. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind kept racing, replaying the moment I opened the bag and found the IDs and phones. It felt like a movie scene, something you see on a screen but never expect to happen in real life. The weight of it all was too much to ignore, but I still didn't know what to do next. I tried looking up the names on the IDs, but none of them seemed to be real. They didn't match any known criminals or missing persons in the city's databases. It was as if the people behind this were ghosts, leaving no trace behind. The next day, I decided to try something different. I took the burner phones to a nearby coffee shop, hoping I could find some kind of signal or information. I connected one to the Wi-Fi, but again there was nothing, no messages, no calls. The phone appeared to be completely wiped clean. I tried calling one of the numbers, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, half expecting the call to go unanswered, but something made me think that this wasn't going to be an ordinary mystery. The day passed slowly, and I found myself obsessing over the phones and IDs. I wanted answers, but I had no idea where to look. I couldn't just ignore it, not after what I had found. It felt like the kind of thing that could get out of hand if I didn't figure it out soon. That evening I decided to visit the alley again, hoping to find something I had missed. But when I arrived, the area was completely different. The dumpsters were gone, the shadows felt less threatening, and the silence was broken by distant laughter and music from a nearby bar. It was as if nothing had ever happened there at all. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I dreamed up the backpack, the IDs, and the phones? No, I couldn't have. I knew what I had seen, and I knew I couldn't just walk away from it. Then I saw something strange, a small piece of paper tucked into the corner of the alley, half hidden under a pile of leaves. I bent down to pick it up, my heart pounding as I unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but legible. It was a list of numbers, addresses, and a few names, none of which I recognized. It didn't make any sense at first, but then it hit me. These were coordinates, locations, places I could go to if I wanted answers. I left the alleyway again, the paper clenched tightly in my hand. I still wasn't sure who had left the backpack or why, but now I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to just forget about it. I had to know the truth, even if it meant stepping into something far bigger and darker than I could have ever imagined. Story 17. I started working at the hotel during the summer when business was booming. It was a small, quiet place tucked away on the outskirts of town, mostly frequented by travelers passing through. The lobby was cozy, and the staff was friendly, so it always felt like a safe and comfortable environment. I enjoyed the job, even if the hours were long and the guests sometimes difficult. However, something strange started happening after I was there for a few months. There was one particular room on the second floor that always seemed to be a bit or different. It was room 302, the one at the far end of the hall, isolated from the other rooms. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but I began to notice something unsettling. Guests who checked into that room would disappear. It wasn't something that happened immediately, but over time it became undeniable. The first time I noticed it, a couple had checked into room 302 for a weekend stay. They were polite, checked in with no issues, and went to their room. A few hours later, I saw them again in the hallway, looking confused and disoriented. I thought they might be lost, but they assured me they were fine. They returned to their room, but after that I never saw them again. The next morning, I checked the guest register to see if they had checked out, but their name wasn't marked as having left. I figured maybe they had decided to extend their stay, but when I went up to room 302 to ask if they needed anything, there was no answer. I knocked several times and still nothing. I had to call housekeeping to check the room, but when they went inside, it was empty. All of their belongings were gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. The bed was still made, the lights off, and the air was unnervingly still. I tried to brush it off as a strange coincidence, but it kept happening. A few weeks later, another guest checked into room 302. This time it was a man traveling alone. He was quiet and kept to himself, which I thought was a bit odd, but nothing too concerning. After he had been in the room for about an hour, I went to check on him, feeling a strange sense of unease. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I went to the front desk to double-check the guest register, and again there was no sign that he had left. I asked housekeeping to check the room, but once again, it was empty. His things were gone, and it was as though he had never been there at all. I didn't know what to think anymore. The disappearances were happening far too often for it to be a coincidence. Each time, there were no signs of struggle, no indication that the guest had left in a hurry. It was as if they simply vanished. I began to feel a strange presence whenever I passed by room 302, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. I started to wonder if something was wrong with the room itself. One evening, after another guest checked in, I decided to keep an eye on the room. I was determined to get to the bottom of it, to figure out what was happening. The night passed normally at first, and I started to relax, thinking maybe it had all been in my head. But around midnight, I heard soft footsteps coming from upstairs. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were there. Curious, I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. I walked slowly down the hall toward room 302, the air growing colder the closer I got. When I reached the door, I knocked once, then twice. No answer. But then I heard something else, a faint whisper coming from inside the room. It was hard to make out, but I was certain it was voices. I felt a chill run down my spine as I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but I could see the outlines of the furniture, the bed, and the desk. I stepped inside, feeling a heavy weight pressing on my chest. The whispering stopped the moment I crossed the threshold. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been before, nothing out of place. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. As I stood there, I heard a sound from the bathroom. It was a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I had to know what was going on. I walked slowly to the bathroom door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, I saw nothing but an empty room. The light above the mirror flickered once before going out completely, leaving me in darkness. I backed out of the bathroom quickly, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone been here recently? Was there something hidden I needed to find I didn't know? But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much darker happening in room 302. I closed the door softly behind me and decided to head back downstairs, but not before locking the door and making a note to check in with the other staff members. The next day, I told my manager about the strange occurrences, but she just brushed it off. She said I was probably just letting my imagination get the best of me, that it was nothing more than coincidence. But as time went on, I could no longer deny what was happening. It wasn't just my imagination. The disappearances were real, and they weren't stopping. After a particularly unsettling night, I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't let another guest disappear without anyone knowing. I made a plan to stay in the hotel overnight and monitor the room again. I had to know what was going on. It was the only way I could get the answers I needed. That night, I positioned myself in a corner of the lobby where I could see the entrance to the second-floor hallway. I sat in the dim light, trying to keep myself as inconspicuous as possible. Hours passed, and it seemed like nothing unusual was happening. But just after midnight, I saw the shadow of someone moving down the hall toward room 302. I held my breath as the figure approached the door, the same door that had seen so many disappearances. I waited, watching as the person knocked on the door, hesitated for a moment, then entered. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the keys and rushed upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When I reached room 302, the door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. Inside, I found the guests standing in the center of the room, staring at the wall. They didn't seem to notice me at first. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. It was like they were in a trance. The air grew colder again, and I felt that same pressure in my chest. I reached out to shake the guest's shoulder, but as I touched them, the room around me seemed to distort. The walls appeared to shift, and the furniture started to blur. I stumbled back, panic rising in my throat as everything around me began to unravel. Suddenly, everything stopped. The room was quiet again, and the guest was gone. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of them. The room was empty, and everything was back to normal. I couldn't explain what had just happened. My head was spinning, and I felt a sense of dread that I had never felt before. I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran back downstairs, my heart racing. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew I couldn't keep working at that hotel. The disappearances, the strange occurrences, they were all connected. I couldn't be part of it anymore. I left the hotel that night and I never returned. It's been years since I left, but the memory of room 302 still haunts me. I've never been able to explain what happened there, but I've learned to trust my instincts. Some places, some things, are better left alone. And sometimes the truth is something you're better off not knowing. Story 18. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The envelope was addressed to someone who hadn't lived in my apartment for years, not since the tragic incident that happened in this very place. I had moved in not long after, and the apartment had always felt like a place to escape. But I couldn't deny the unease that crept up when I saw the name on the letter. The handwriting on the envelope was neat, almost meticulous, and I instantly recognized the name from the news coverage years ago. I stared at it for a long time, unsure of what to do. The name belonged to the person who had been murdered here, someone whose death had shocked the entire neighborhood. The police had never found the killer, and the apartment had become a sort of silent reminder of the tragedy. I thought I had put it behind me, moved on with my life. Yet here I was, holding a piece of mail that seemed to bring everything back to the surface. After a few minutes of hesitation, I opened the letter. Inside was a simple piece of paper, folded neatly in half. It was typed, no handwriting this time. The message was short, but chilling. It read, "You've taken what wasn't yours. Now you'll pay for it." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Who could have sent this? And why now? I told myself it was just a prank, some sick joke. Maybe someone knew about the history of the apartment and thought it would be funny. I tried to push the feeling of dread out of my mind and tossed the letter aside. But the next morning, there was another envelope, this time with a different message. It was a single line, "You should have left when you had the chance." I felt my stomach turn. I had no idea who was behind this or why they were targeting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random occurrence. There was something about the letters that felt personal, almost like they were meant for me. I thought about the woman who had lived here before me, her tragic end. She had been alone, with no family nearby. I wondered if I was being haunted by her memory, or if someone connected to her was still holding a grudge. Days passed, and more letters arrived, each one more unnerving than the last. They all referenced the incident that had occurred here, some cryptic and others threatening. "You don't belong here," one said. Another read, "I'm watching you." The final letter I received was the worst. It contained a photograph of the apartment, the very room where she had been found. My room. The image was grainy, but unmistakable. It was taken from outside, through the window. Whoever had sent it had been watching me for days. I was terrified. I couldn't understand how this was happening, why someone would go to such lengths. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. The apartment that had once felt like a fresh start now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I knew I had to do something, but what? Who could I turn to? The police wouldn't take me seriously. The case had been closed years ago, and the killer was never found. I started researching the woman who had been murdered here, trying to find any clue as to who might have a reason to target me. There was so little information available, just brief news articles about her death and the investigation that had gone nowhere. She had been a quiet, solitary person, no family in town, no close friends. Her life had seemed uneventful until the day she was killed. As I dug deeper, I found that her death had been part of a pattern. There had been several similar cases in the area, all unsolved, all victims living alone. It was as if someone had been systematically targeting people who had no one to miss them, people who wouldn't raise suspicion. I was horrified to think that I might be next, that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, but I didn't know where to go. My friends were all too far away, and I couldn't afford a new place right now. I started staying at work late, avoiding being home as much as possible. But it didn't help. The letters kept coming. One day I returned to my apartment to find the door slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't left it that way. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing seemed out of place, except for a new letter placed on the kitchen counter. I opened it slowly, bracing myself for what I would read. It was a drawing this time, not a message. The drawing was of me, standing in my own apartment, but with a shadowy figure looming behind me. The figure's face was obscured, but the outline was unmistakable. It looked like the silhouette of the woman who had lived here before me. I felt sick to my stomach, my knees buckling as I sank into a chair. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with this growing sense of fear and dread hanging over me. I found a temporary place to stay, a friend who had a spare room. But the letters didn't stop. They followed me, showing up at my new address. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, as if someone was always watching. Finally, in a last-ditch effort to make sense of everything, I went back to the apartment. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to find answers. I brought the letters with me. hoping they would lead me to some kind of resolution. The apartment felt colder than I remembered, the silence pressing in on me. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the letters, trying to piece everything together. It was then that I noticed something strange. The final letter I had received was different. There was something hidden in the folds of the paper. I unfolded it carefully, revealing a small key. It was old, worn, but unmistakable. It looked like the key to an old lock, one I had never seen before. My pulse quickened as I realized that the key was a clue, something that might lead me to the truth. I spent the next few hours searching the apartment, looking for a lock that might match the key. Eventually, I found it. Behind the closet, hidden beneath the floorboards, was a small trapdoor. I inserted the key and turned it, the metal creaking as it unlocked. The door opened with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow space below. I hesitated, but curiosity drove me forward. I climbed down into the hidden basement. What I found there shocked me. The basement was small, filled with boxes and old furniture. But it wasn't the contents that disturbed me. It was the walls. They were covered in photographs, the same grainy photos that had been sent to me in the letters. Only these were of the previous tenant,